Today we are starting a new series called Everyday Idolatry, and I've been thinking about this one for quite a few months, and so I'm excited to start the study with you. And so if you're new or you've just been coming the last few weeks, it's a great time to start checking out our church family, and hope you are engaged with this study over the next few weeks. When I think of the word idol, the first image that comes into my head is that of a statue. And so let's begin the message with a little statue trivia. We'll start with the most famous statue in the United States of America, which would be the Statue of Liberty. What city is the Statue of Liberty located in? New York City is correct. What country gave us the Statue of Liberty? France. Very good. Do you know the name of the woman that is the Statue of Liberty? Few of you got it. Her name is Libertas, and she is the Roman goddess of freedom. Now let's go a little broader than the United States of America. What country do you think has the largest statue on earth? It is the country of China, and the statue is called the Spring Temple Buddha. This statue is 500 feet tall, so that's somewhere around 2/3 the size of the Devon Tower. So this is a very large statue. Now let me hit you with the hypothetical here. Let's say that you're traveling to New York or China and you come across this statue or Statue of Liberty, and you're looking at it, you're reading some information about it, and then you notice a group of people that are on their knees and they are bowing down to the statue. What kind of thoughts would go through your head if you saw that? Or how would you feel if you saw that? My guess is probably a mixture there. Maybe you'd have some curiosity, maybe some sympathy, probably respect. You could understand these people have a different worldview than you. They're obviously bowing down to a statue, but you would respect the difference there. You might have a little bit of sadness, like, oh, isn't that sad that someone's worshiping an idol? Maybe you'd have some disappointment. Maybe you'd have some relief. Relief happens to us when we observe someone else doing something that we deem wrong or false, because when we observe that, it makes us feel like we're in the right, or what we are thinking is true. In fact, I experienced this feeling of relief just a few weeks ago. Anna, Heidi, my daughters, and myself were taking a walk, and we walk past this man wearing a red shirt. He looks very nervous. Right after he passes us, I turn to kind of give him a second look because he looks so anxious. As I turn, a police car has driven onto the path I'm walking. 2 officers jump out, and a chase ensues, and they tackle this man and arrest him. And so I have many emotions going on at this moment, fear being a big one. But at some point, when things settled down, I felt a sense of relief, because whatever he was doing seemed to be in the wrong, and therefore that made me feel like I was in the right. I also feel this sense of relief when I read passages in the Old Testament about idolatry. So for example, in the book of Daniel, you've got this story where King Nebuchadnezzar puts up this really tall statue, and he asks everybody to bow down and worship. So everybody bows down and worships, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they stand up. They don't bow down. And when I read that story, I feel this sense of solidarity with these 3 men. And I think, well, I'd be with them. And I feel this sense of disdain, a little bit of superiority to the people that bow down. In fact, if I could just take a time machine and go back to that moment, what I would want to say to the people who were bowing down to the idol is something like, stop doing that. It's just a piece of metal. Like, don't profess your allegiance and your faith and your life to something that has no value and has no meaning. Like, I would want to teach them, put them in their place a little bit. I feel the same sense of, I guess, discouragement when I read the story in the Old Testament of the golden calf. Israel sees this miracle. God parts the Red Seas. They get across the Red Sea, and what do? They pull their rings and their bracelets and their necklaces off, and they give them to Aaron, and they say, Aaron, will you make us a god? And that one just confuses me because, again, in my mind, I'm thinking, you just saw God perform some of the most astonishing miracles that have ever been recorded in the Bible. It's amazing what God does with the 10 plagues and then with the parting of the Red Seas. And then you get across from there and you have Aaron construct this piece of metal about the size of an oversized microwave, and then you worship that? Like, what are you thinking? Like, come on, people. And my guess is you've probably had moments like that too, where you read in the Bible and you feel maybe a smugness. I'm really glad I'm not like the people back then because I know not to worship an idol. Now, this series is about everyday idolatry. In other words, we probably need to be cautious about that feeling of smugness because idolatry, it's not just for the ancient people. It's for us too. In fact, I read a book about 6 months ago. It was really eye-opening to me. It's by this Old Testament scholar, Christopher Wright. It's called Here Are Your Gods. And it was a really helpful guide to understanding what idolatry actually meant back then, and then what does it really mean for us today. And so what I want to do, this is a foundational introductory sermon that'll set up the rest of the series. I do want to cover just a few things that Christopher Wright talks about in his book, and some of this you're going to be like, Phil, I already knew this, or you're getting too technical here, but just a few thoughts because it's going to help set up the rest of where the series is going to go. So the first thing I want to point out, this idea that comes from Christopher Wright, is that the idols represented gods. Now again, you might think, well, duh, I know that. Well, Wright makes the point that even people in the times of the Bible, they knew that too. Like, they weren't under the impression that when they bowed down to this piece of metal, that the metal, it was God. There was a difference between the two. So, for example, there's this, just a one-liner from the book of Isaiah where Scripture says, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops low, their idols are borne by beasts of burden. And so it's actually, this is an image of a cart being carried, and there's an idol on the cart, and Bel and Nebo are the gods, and they are in actually a comical sense trying to balance the idol from falling over. And so this is just illustrating the idea that in the Bible, even these ancient people, they understood there was a difference between the idol and the God that the idol represented. So they got that. They're not quite as ignorant as we might think that they might be. Now here's the key question, though, if you're just kind of stick with me for a minute on this one. What exactly is a lowercase g God in the Old Testament? Like Baal. What is Baal? Is Baal a spiritual, unseen being that is somehow trying to thwart the purposes of Yahweh? Like, does Baal have headquarters? Does Baal have messengers? Does Baal have strategy to lead Israel astray? Like, what exactly is Baal? Well, this particular question has actually been asked by lots of Christians, lots of church people, lots of scholars for many, many years. And it's interesting what the angle that Wright takes on this. And so here's my summary of what his position would be, and I'll explain how he got there. The gods represented ideology. So here's what I mean by that. An ideology is an idea that a group of people think is true. That becomes an ideology. And so gods in the Old Testament, like Baal, would have represented not necessarily unseen spiritual beings that were opposed to Yahweh, but rather they represented an idea or a collection of ideas that defined a particular group of people. So let me explain here. So there's a lot of verses in the Old Testament that go something like this. Here's one of them from Isaiah 45. I am the Lord, there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. So over and over in the Old Testament, you get this note that rings that Yahweh is God alone. And these other beings that people talk about, they are entities when it comes to God. So it's not like Yahweh is paired off against some equal opponent in a boxing ring and they duke it out. It is, no, there's Yahweh and nothing else. And so what that means, though, is if it's nothing, like if Baal is nothing, then what is he? Well, he represents the ideology of the people who worship him. So here's one example that I find really helpful. If you know your Bibles, there's a really interesting story in the Old Testament where Elijah goes to Mount Carmel, and he has this big battle with the prophets of Baal. And so you can go to that story and ask the question, who is Baal in that story? Is Baal this powerful spiritual being who actually interacts with the world? No, he's actually not. Baal does not send fire. Baal does nothing. Like, he's a non-entity in comparison to Yahweh, who at the end of the story brings fire from heaven. Now, then what is Baal? Well, think about the people. The prophets of Baal, they are chanting and singing and slashing themselves and worshiping. They've got an entire set of rituals and customs based on Baal. And so from one vantage point, Baal is nothing, but what he is he represents the ideology of the people. So all that to say, number one, idols, they represented gods in the Bible. Number two, the gods represented an ideology. Now here's a third idea, and again, these build on one another, but kind of stick with me here. Here's a direct quote from Christopher Wright that I found very intriguing. He says, "The alleged gods are in fact no different from the idols that represent them. They are both human constructs." That had really never occurred to me, that someone like Baal was just as man-made as the idol. That thought had never really entered my head. And so my summary of this point would simply be, the gods, like the idols, are both inventions of a corrupt people. So here's a good one-liner from Jeremiah chapter 2. Scripture says, "Where then are the gods you've made for yourselves?" So the implication there is, you made them. Well, again, this is a different category, at least for me, as I'm beginning my study of this, that I've always thought, well, of course it makes sense that someone would, like, if I want to make an idol, I get a piece of silver and I, craft it to be an idol. And there's so many stories in the Bible, and that makes sense to me. But if you really get into the text of the Old Testament, the God behind the idol is also being made by the people. And so it might go something like this. A nation might say, we really want to go to war, so therefore let's create a god, the god of war. Or maybe it's, we really want our crops to grow, so let's create this god of rain. Or maybe it's, we want to practice our sexuality in this particular way, so therefore let's create this god of fertility and associate the practices that we like with this god. And so this is basically how this developed in the Old Testament. Now, it might have taken centuries for these gods to come into existence in the minds of the people. And so we come to this point in the Old Testament where it's been happening so long, for so many centuries, that people start to believe these gods are real. Like, they lose sense of the fact that they are the creation of humanity itself. So here's another example of this same idea from Revelation chapter 9. So Revelation 9, there's this list in about verse 20 of a list of idols. So it says you've got idols of gold and silver and stone, wood. It's talking about physical statues. Underneath that is a list of detestable practices. So we've got murder, sexual immorality, theft, magic arts, things like that. So it's describing this entire corrupt way of life. You've got practices, you've got idols. Well, what's really interesting is the way those lists are set up, like the header of those lists is, they did not repent of the works of their hands. And so the idea of Revelation 9, this particular part, or one of the implications is, the practices themselves, these immoral behaviors, And the idols that support them, they're all the product of this corrupt humanity. So in other words, you have this particular group of people that over time comes up with a kind of life that they like. Well, we kind of like stealing things. And we kind of like using our power to belittle and oppress other people. We like all these things. So therefore, we're going to create the behaviors, then we're going to create gods that support the behaviors, and then we're going to create idols that support the gods that support the behaviors. But again, the point here is that all of this is the construct of our own, like the mind of humanity has created these gods. So here's another example from the Bible about how ideology, ideas, can be very synonymous with lowercase g gods. So this is another Old Testament story. There's a war about to happen here. You've got a really powerful nation, Assyria, and their king is King Sennacherib. And they've got all the power. They are just mowing nations down. And then you've got little King Hezekiah and little nation Judah, and Judah is the next target. And so King Sennacherib gets up and makes this intimidation speech where he's just calling Judah out, you're about to go down. And it's really interesting how King Sennacherib uses the word God in his speech. So here's the speech, 2 Kings chapter 18. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharim, Hena, and Iva? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save this land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? So he's coming in and making this big speech basically saying, my God is better than your God. Now, what exactly does he mean by that? Is King Sennacherib referring to this spiritual entity that is somehow threatening Yahweh? I don't think he's referring to that. I think he's referring to a particular ideology of his day that he has believed in and that he believes will conquer Israel. And that ideology, to get very specific, is his army. He's promoting the power of his army here. In fact, just for illustration purposes, watch how this paragraph reads if you exchange the word lowercase g God for army. It reads like this: Has the army of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the armies of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the armies of Sepharim and Hena and Iva? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the armies of the countries has been able to save this land from me? How then can your army deliver Jerusalem from my hand? So what's going on here is that the word God, lowercase g, is a placeholder for a larger ideology of power. So in a sense, what's happening here is Assyria has developed a particular way of life based on power and the economic exploitation of underprivileged people. They conquer, they rule. To support and substantiate this ideology, they create a god for it. And then to support the god, they create idols to support that god. In other words, to summarize this whole point here, people in the ancient world made gods out of three primary things. Things they feared, things they needed, things they wanted. If I fear it, if I need it, if I want it, then over time I'll create a god to support one of those three things. Now, all that to say, okay, so what are you talking about? Why does this matter? Why are you doing all this technical Old Testament terms here? The reason this matters is because we have to be very careful about being smug about Old Testament idolatry. So when I go to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and just assume that I'm going to be the one standing up and not bowing down, that's not necessarily true. We have to be really, really careful here about feeling superior to people in the Bible when it comes to idolatry. And the reason is this: modern idolatry comes in the form of accepted ideology. So of course we're not going to bow down to Baal. Of course we're not praying to Molech. Because those kinds of gods they're not the kinds of God that we worship. However, think about this. The unquenchable thirst for wealth is an ideology. It's an agreed upon idea. And we are very well versed with that ideology. Or think about the glorification of sex. Not just as something we have to procreate and keep the human species going, but as something we worship. That's an ideology. And we are all well versed in that. We have graduated from that school. It's a very accepted ideology. So is the veneration of sports, or the deification of our devices, or the adoration of youth, or the promotion of self. These are just the air we breathe. It's just agreed upon cultural trends that they're just so common that we don't even consider that they might not necessarily be true. They're everywhere. It's the conversations we have, it's the things we buy, it's the shows we watch. It's just so much a part of our culture. And so here's the scary part. Modern idolatry in some ways is harder to deal with than ancient idolatry because it deals in terms of invisibility. Like we can't see it. It's just the air that we breathe. So here's a few examples of this. So Steve Jobs died because of modern day idolatry. And that modern day idolatry had nothing to do with technology. Steve Jobs bought into an ideology concerning food. And early in his adult life, he bought into this idea that if he just drank a bunch of fruit juice and ate a ton of carrots, that he was going to be fine and he would never get sick. And so most of his diet was that. Lots and lots and lots of carrots, some other vegetables too, but a lot of carrots and then fruit juice. Well, in 2003, he got pancreatic cancer. And it was very mild, very treatable, and the doctor says, hey, this is no problem. Success rate's great. We just need you to do this surgery. And Steve Jobs said, no, I can't do that. That doesn't fit with my ideology. And Steve Jobs was so attached to his ideology that my carrots and my fruit juice is going to fix this, that he just wouldn't have the surgery. And so his friends and his family said, Steve, have the surgery. Please, have the surgery. And he kept saying, no, I'm fine. I'm just going to keep eating my carrots. Everything's going to be fine. Well, finally, the friends and the family, they convinced him, Steve, this is not working. You've got to have the surgery. So he finally had the surgery. They took the cancer out, but it was too late. The cancer had developed too much. So yes, they took it out, but the cancer came back, and eventually that cancer took Steve Jobs' life a few years later. Well, isn't that a sad story? And what's going on there is Steve Jobs was so attached to this particular ideology that he could no longer evaluate it objectively. Like he saw it as, this is the truth. Now, the crazy thing is most ideologies contain truth, but just because something contains truth doesn't mean that it's all true. And so for Steve Jobs, what happened is the subtitle of this series, A Good Thing. It's great to eat your vegetables. Like, kids, you don't need to go home and say, I'm not sure what Phil said, but I think he said stop eating carrots. That's not what I mean here. When a good thing becomes a God thing, that's a bad thing. And this is what happened when it came to Steve Jobs. He was so attached to this ideology, this has to be true, that he could no longer see the world objectively. Here's another example. This one probably hits more closer to home for a lot of us. So I read the most interesting study recently about social media. So these three guys at Cambridge did this massive study about posts made on social media in the last 4 or 5 years. And they took an enormous data set for this. They studied 3 million posts in their study. And what they were looking for is which kind of posts generated the most traction online, the most engagement. Which post got the most likes, or just the most reaction with all the other emotions you can click on when it comes to a post, and which post got shared the most, and which post got the most comments. Just engagement is what they were after. And they surveyed so many different kinds of news outlets, progressive, conservative, and everything in between. 3 million data points. Which ones got the most engagement? The conclusion of their study, you'll not be surprised, was this. The Outgroup language is the strongest predictor of social media engagement across all relevant predictors measured. So what do they mean by that? What they mean is if a news site, or if you or I do this too, if we post a story that's just, my group is great, whatever that group is, that gets some reaction. But if you really want people to react, you post something along the narrative of, the other group is horrible. That's what outgroup language means. So when you demonize the other group, that's when people get on, yeah, that's right, I'm going to share this, and yes, yeah. That was their conclusion. And so, and I'm sure that doesn't surprise a lot of you, because this is just the way social media is. And so I found this interesting. There are two examples of this in the article I read about this, where on Twitter, the two most engaged videos were, and this is in no particular order, but one of them was Mike Pence blatantly lying about something, and the other was Joe Biden having a brain freeze. So you've got one video which is very much going from left to right politically, and the other video going from right to left. But what's happening here is both videos created immense engagement because they were driven by the idea, hey, if I just criticize and demonize my opponent, that's what the world likes. Now, why do I bring this up? My general observation of this study and other things I've read, and I'm sure things that you've seen and read it as well, is this. Embarrassing your opponent is a virtuous practice. That's my observation based on, like, us, the world. Now, can we just pause for a minute? Can we evaluate this statement? So first of all, let me ask some questions about this statement. Number one, what is this? This statement is an ideology. Like, it's an idea that many, many people agree with and believe in and think is true and practice. Even if they don't say it's true, they live this out. That's an ideology. Where did it come from? It came from us collectively, like humanity. There was no person in a lab, however many decades or centuries ago, that said, I want to create this value system the world's going to believe in. No, we all endorsed this way of life, and now it's become this ideology. It's like we made it. Now, here's another question to ask about this. Is this true? Embarrassing your opponent is a virtuous practice. Is that true? Like in the deepest sense, like the core of who you are as a Jesus person, created in the image of Yahweh, God, is that true? Jesus Christ himself said, you remember this, love your enemies. So the idea that embarrassing your opponent is a virtuous practice, like, that is not of God. That is false. And the problem has become we are so much immersed in this particular ideology, it has become so normal to us that we no longer recognize that it's actually a false God that many of us bow down to on a daily basis without even knowing we're worshiping it. Like this, again, this is the crazy part about everyday, modern-day idolatry, is that you don't know it's there. It's so saturated in our own culture. And so here's a really haunting verse which I think helps us understand the stakes of idolatry and really the stakes of this series that we're launching into today. Psalm 115, verse 4. The psalmist says, those who make them, as in who make gods, those who make them will be like them. And so will all who trust in them. See, here's the progression of how gods are made. Step one, we make them. Based on what we need, based on what we want, based on what we fear. We make them. Step number two, we become like them. So whether that's money or sex or power, whatever that is, I become like the gods I worship. And then step number 3 is we're destroyed by them. We make them, we become like them, and we're destroyed by them. And so, let me end on some good news here. The good news is, and think about this, if we collectively as human beings made these gods, we can take them down. You have the power, I have the power to deconstruct the gods of our day. How do we do that? Well, one way you do that is you come back for the rest of the series. I'm just setting up the rest of the series. But fundamentally, I do want to just voice this one principle as we close today. The fundamental practice against idolatry is worship. So we're all worshiping something, and the worship of God, Yahweh, on His throne, that is the chief way that we push back against modern day idolatry. You see, in the very beginning of time, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. There's Adam and Eve in the garden. In the beginning, we worshiped God, and we used creation. As in, we took what was at our disposal and we made the earth flourish. We stewarded the earth by using the good creation of God. So we worshiped God, we used creation. Today that's flipped. We worship creation, and then we use God to achieve our own purposes. So the primary way that we recalibrate the heart is by worshiping. And so we are about to sing another song and worship here. And as we close this first message of this series, if you've got a need that you want us to address publicly, you are welcome to come share that need with me. Let's stand and let's sing.